So you want to suggest, I think, if I've understood you correctly, that the function of language is thought, not necessarily communication. And so I'm just wondering, so some linguistic things that we do, or the practices that we engage in that we'd be inclined to call linguistic, are speaking to one another. Speaking to one another, also correcting each other's use of language. So if I point at a duck and I say, look, it's a lovely pigeon, somebody will say, that's not a pigeon, it's a duck. Right? So we try to get our language used to conform, so we're all speaking, using the words in the same way. Do you mean that kind of thing is far thought? And if so, how?
It takes place, but if you just think about it for a minute, probably 99.9% of your use of language is internal. It doesn't involve any other people. So you can't, it takes a tremendous act of will not to think to yourself in language. It's almost impossible. Every minute of the day you're talking to yourself, when you sleep, doing the same thing. There are cases of the kind that you describe. There are all kinds of uses of the system, just like there are all kinds of uses of the spine. But that doesn't tell you much. In fact, if you really look closely, this has not been studied. There's another dogma here that's blocking the study of this. It's a dogma that in the modern period actually goes back to pretty much to Quine, and then it's picked up by John Searle and others. The idea that there can't be anything in the mind that is not available to introspection. Nothing can be in the mind unless it may not be conscious, but it's got to be available to consciousness. Otherwise, it's not in the mind. That's totally hopeless. Most of what goes on internally is completely beyond the level of introspection. For example, the case that I mentioned. I mean, the principle, which is pretty well established, that linear order is not available for syntactic and semantic computation. You can't introspect into that. It's not conscious. The same is true of just visual perception. For example, one of the most interesting results in the study of visual perception is a conclusion that came out of David Marr's lab, Shimon Ullman's principle, what's called the rigidity principle. They were able to show that if you present a subject with tachistoscopic presentations, just a screen with a couple of dots on it, if you have successive presentations, not many, maybe 3 or 4 presentations of a few dots on the screen, what you perceive is a rigid object in motion. Okay, that's pretty curious too. In experience, you have no experience with rigid objects. Throughout all of human history, till very recently, there weren't any rigid objects. Like if you walk in a forest, no rigid objects around. But somehow the system, it's probably true for other, it hasn't been really tested on other organisms, it's hard to test, but it's probably true for apes and cats and so on. Our system is just designed to impose rigid objects in motion on virtually no data. And that by now the mathematical properties have been worked out, the neurological properties less known. But again, you can't bring that to consciousness. And I think the same is true of speaking to yourself. Try it sometime. Think about what you're actually doing when you talk to what you call talking to yourself. I think you'll find that what's actually in your mind consciously is just fragments. Little fragments flit by, and out of those fragments you can suddenly construct a sentence, a meaningful sentence. And that meaningful sentence is probably being constructed unconsciously, beyond the level of consciousness, internally by whatever these generative processes are. And bits and pieces of it reach consciousness, like a couple of fragments of phrases. And that's what we call thinking to ourselves. And by now that's, that seems to be true in other domains too. There's some by now famous experiments, the Libet experiments on decision making, which have been widely misinterpreted. But what was found was that if you decide to do something, say I decide to pick this up, milliseconds before I decide, something's going on in the motor areas, namely the right organization of motion to pick it up. Well, the immediate conclusion that was drawn from this is, okay, that shows there's no freedom of will. It doesn't show anything of this sort. What it shows is that everything that's going on is beyond the level of consciousness, which we know in every other domain too. But as long as philosophy of mind is going to be bound by this dogma that you can't go beyond what's available to consciousness, or else it's not in the mind, it's never going to discover anything. And I think, and there's a whole collection, and I think that dogma too probably goes back to behaviorism. I mean, it's pretty clear in Quine's case. It's Quine, you may remember, distinguishes, it says actions can be in accord with principles or guided by principles. That's all. In accord with principles means like the planets following Kepler's laws. Guided by principles means you formulate what you're going to do and then you do it. And say virtually all action doesn't fall in any of those categories, either of those categories. And with John Searle, it comes up as what he calls his association principle. Has to be available to consciousness somehow before it can be attributed to the mind. And spins off a whole theory about rules and so on. But that's just approaching these questions with your hands tied behind your back. And I think the same is true of the considerations that you mentioned. They're real, but it's very peripheral to the use of language.